Thank you, Mr. President. Good morning, Mr. President. Good morning, members of the court. Myanmar made two arguments about genocidal intent. First, they denied that they acted with genocidal intent in their treatment of the Rohingya. Second, they argued that even if genocidal intent can be inferred from their conduct, it is not the only plausible inference that can be drawn. I will respond to the first argument. Professor Sands will answer the second. What is most striking, Mr. President, is what Myanmar has not denied. So I will begin there. Myanmar has not denied that the UN fact-finding mission reached this conclusion. There is no reasonable conclusion to draw other than the inference of genocidal intent from the state's pattern of conduct. Nor has Myanmar denied that the fact-finding mission reached this conclusion based on 7 specific indicators which it found to be, quote, indicators of genocidal intent in the international case law. Nor has Myanmar challenged the propriety of the fact-finding mission's use of these 7 indicators, or any one of them, for inferring genocidal intent. Professor Akhavan identified them on Tuesday. I call them to your attention today only for the purpose of considering what Myanmar said or failed to say about them yesterday. This is the first indicator of genocidal intent. First, the Tatmadaws' extreme brutality during its attacks on the Rohingya. Professor Akhavan and Mr. Lowenstein gave you many heart-rending examples of this from the reports of the UN fact-finding mission. Myanmar did not deny any of it. In fact, its agent admitted that, quote, it cannot be ruled out that disproportionate force was used by members of the defense services. Second, the organized nature of the Tatmadaws' destruction. Mr. Lowenstein showed you how the Tatmadaw employed the same brutal tactics in each Rohingya village, in clearance operations that were planned and ordered by senior military staff. Myanmar did not deny this. Nor did they deny that 392 Rohingya villages were systematically destroyed, either totally or partially, during these operations. Third, the enormity and nature of the sexual violence perpetrated against women and girls during the clearance operations. We heard nothing about sexual violence from Myanmar yesterday. Not a single word about it, not from the agent, not from any of their counsel. Because it is undeniable and unspeakable, they chose to ignore it completely. I can't really blame them. I would hate to be the one having to defend it. Fourth, the insulting, derogatory, racist, and exclusionary utterance of Myanmar officials and others prior, during, and after the clearance operations. Myanmar did not deny any of this either, nor could it. The agent even underscored its significance. Quote, hate narratives are not simply confined to hate speech. language that contributes to extreme polarization also amounts to hate narratives. And here is such a narrative from the Facebook page of Senior General Min Aung Hlaing, the Commander-in-Chief of the Tatmadaw, before Facebook took his page down. Posted at the height of the 2017 clearance operations, it described, quote, the Bengali problem as an as yet, quote, unfinished job that the government in office is taking great care in solving. He added, we openly declare that absolutely our country has no Rohingya race. Returning to the 7 indicators of genocidal intent. Fifth, the existence of discriminatory plans and policies, such as the citizenship law and the national verification card process, as well as the government's efforts to clear, raise, confiscate, and build on land in a manner that sought to change the demographic and ethnic composition of Rakhine State. Again, no denial by Myanmar. How could it? Myanmar's laws and policies overtly and expressly discriminate against the Rohingya. All the agent could say was that birth certificates would now be issued regardless of religious background, but not citizenship, and nothing about the confiscation of Rohingya lands. 6, the government's tolerance for public rhetoric of hatred and contempt for the Rohingya. Myanmar did not deny this either. And 7th, the state's failure to investigate and prosecute gross violations of international human rights law and serious violations of international humanitarian law. This is the only indicator of genocidal intent, the only one of the 7 that Myanmar has disputed. The agent herself asked, quote, can there be genocidal intent on the part of a state that actively investigates, prosecutes, and punishes soldiers and officers who are accused of wrongdoing? Mr. President, we could not help but ask ourselves, what state is she talking about? It is certainly not Myanmar. The agent herself made this perfectly clear. Quote, under its 2008 constitution, Myanmar has a military justice system. Criminal cases against soldiers or officers for possible war crimes committed in Rakhine must be and prosecuted by that system. To her credit, the agent acknowledged the difficulties with such a system. Quote, it is never easy for armed forces to recognize self-interest in accountability for their members and to implement a will to accountability through actual investigations and prosecutions. It certainly isn't easy in Myanmar. How can anyone possibly expect the Tatmadaw to hold itself accountable for genocidal acts against the Rohingya when 6 of its top generals, including the Commander-in-Chief, Senior General Min Aung Hlaing, have all been accused of genocide by the UN fact-finding mission and recommended for criminal prosecution? In addition to Senior General Min Aung Hlaing, These include the Deputy Commander-in-Chief, Vice Senior General So Win, and the commanders of the two light infantry divisions, the 33rd and the 99th, which were primarily responsible for carrying out the clearance operations against the Rohingya, Brigadier General Ong Ong and Brigadier General Than U. 2 days ago, on 10 December, International Human Rights Day, the United States government imposed sanctions on all of them. The official announcement by the U.S. Department of the Treasury, at tab 25 of your folders, described the crimes of which they are accused. When you read this document, you will see, under the name of each of these generals, that these are the same genocidal acts that the UN fact-finding mission reported and that Professor Akhavan and Mr. Lowenstein described on Tuesday. Of particular interest, in light of the agent's comment on accountability, the United States government warned that, quote, such abuses and the continuing impunity must stop. Burma's military must address the climate of impunity and cease abuses and violations of universally accepted human rights. It should come as no surprise, then, that the Tatmadaw has not been willing to investigate, prosecute, or punish its own members for crimes against the Rohingya. There has been just one prosecution, which was initiated only in response to an international outcry and ended with full pardons issued to the perpetrators. I beg the court's forgiveness for displaying these photographs at tab 26, which are difficult to look at, and some in the courtroom might wish to look away. But the extreme brutality of the Tatmadaw toward the Rohingya is part of the evidence of genocidal intent. Even Myanmar has not denied this. This is a photo obtained by Reuters reporters of 10 Rohingya men in Tatmadaw custody with their wrists tied behind their backs at In Din in Rakhine State. This is obtained by the same reporters immediately after they were executed at point-blank range. After the photos were published worldwide, the Tatmadaw made an arrest, not of the soldiers who committed these brutal murders, but of the Reuters reporters. They were tried by a military court, convicted of violating the Official Secrets Act, and sentenced to 7 years of imprisonment. The international community came down hard on Myanmar for this, and the Tatmadaw eventually put the killers on trial and sentenced them, but gave them full military pardons after serving only 7 months. The message was not that soldiers would be held accountable for crimes against the Rohingya, but exactly the opposite. Even the agent admitted, quote, many of us in Myanmar were unhappy with the pardons. Unhappy, perhaps, but absolutely unable or unwilling to do anything about it. The agent and Professor Okoa mentioned one other prosecution by the Tatmadaw. What they neglected to tell you was that the victims were not Rohingyas and the crime was not committed in Rakhine State. It had nothing to do with the Rohingya. We were also told about the initiation of a new court-martial proceeding on 25 November 2019. 2 weeks after the Gambia's application was filed and 2 weeks before these hearings began. Could there be any connection? Reference was made yesterday to an international commission of inquiry created by Myanmar to investigate events in Rakhine State. We were told by the agent that it might lead to new prosecutions. But that is not how the chair of the commission sees it. She stated very clearly that, quote, there will be no blaming of anybody, no finger pointing of anybody because we don't achieve anything by that procedure. On Tuesday, we called your attention to the observations of the UN Special Rapporteur for Human Rights in Myanmar. She wrote, as you will recall, quote, those responsible for these violations enjoy impunity, which perpetuates the devastating cycle of abuse, and that Myanmar is, quote, incapable of delivering accountability. Now perhaps you can better appreciate how well-founded these observations are. Mr. President, Myanmar's agent told you that Myanmar is, quote, committed to the voluntary, safe, and dignified repatriation of displaced persons from Rakhine under the framework agreement reached between Bangladesh and Myanmar. She then asked another rhetorical question, quote, how can there be an ongoing genocide or genocidal intent when these concrete steps are being taken in Rakhine? Professor Okoa spent much of her time extolling the virtues of this supposedly wonderful repatriation program. In fact, it is a complete fraud. Even Professor Okoa admitted, quote, it is true that few displaced persons have returned. The UN fact-finding mission explained why in its September 2018 report. While the Myanmar government has, in principle, committed to Rohingya repatriation, nothing thus far indicates this will be in a manner ensuring respect for human rights, essential for a safe, dignified, and sustainable return. The fact-finding report continues. On the contrary, Myanmar is making active efforts to prevent this return through the consolidation of the destruction of Rohingya villages, through appropriation of vacated land and terrain clearance, erasing every trace of the Rohingya communities, and the construction on this land of houses for other ethnic groups. This deplorable situation did not change as of the fact-finding mission's September 2019 report. Conditions in Myanmar are unsafe, unsustainable, and impossible for approximately 1 million displaced Rohingya to return to their homes and lands. The fact-finding report continues. The government is able, but unwilling, to change conditions in Rakhine State to ensure the Rohingya are able to enjoy all of their human rights. This is perhaps the strongest indication of why Rohingya justifiably insist that they are not prepared to return at this time. Professor Okoa claimed that Myanmar's lack of genocidal intent is proven by UNHCR's collaboration with the government on repatriation of displaced Rohingya. But she failed to quote from any of UNHCR's actual reports, including this one to the Security Council. Conditions are not yet conducive to the voluntary repatriation of Rohingya refugees. The causes of their flight have not been addressed, and we have yet to see substantive progress on addressing the exclusion and denial of rights that has deepened over the last decades, rooted in their lack of citizenship. Nor did she quote from this UNHCR report. UNHCR and UNDP, as was mentioned, have committed to helping Myanmar create conditions inside Rakhine State that would be conducive to the voluntary and sustainable return of refugees, meaning freedom of movement and a pathway to citizenship for those who remain. These conditions were stipulated in the MOU, but are not yet in place. We are still waiting for access to carry out our work. These conditions are still not in place, Mr. President. Senior Myanmar government and military officials refuse even to use the word Rohingya in order to preserve their racist myth that no such group exists. The court will have noted that the agent, as is her custom, refused to refer to the Muslims of Rakhine State as Rohingya. She uttered the word only in reciting the full formal name of the ARSA insurgent group. Myanmar's rejection of the Rohingya and its failure to carry out its commitments to UNHCR and UNDP demonstrate that it has no intention of allowing the displaced Rohingya to return. This is the view of Bangladesh, which Professor Okoa mistakenly depicted as having a favorable view of Myanmar's commitment to repatriation. On 9 June 2019, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs issued the following statement. The government of Myanmar failed to restore normalcy in northern Rakhine and make any visible progress in creating an environment conducive for return, which is an essential precondition for the commencement of repatriation. Other than making hollow promises, Myanmar has so far made hardly any progress in fulfilling its obligations. Professor Okoa misconstrues the willingness of Bangladesh and other states to promote repatriation of the Rohingya as endorsement of Myanmar's actions. China and Japan are to be commended for contributing to infrastructure and transportation to facilitate repatriation. And India, too, is to be applauded for its encouragement of repatriation. But it is up to Myanmar to create the conditions conducive for voluntary return, as UNHCR has repeatedly reminded it, and it has stubbornly refused to do so, as both UNHCR and the UN fact-finding mission have reported. And as a result, as even Myanmar's council admits, no significant repatriation has occurred. Reference was made to a commission headed by former Secretary General Kofi Annan, which presented a report in August 2017. It is of no assistance to Myanmar in these proceedings because, as the UN fact-finding mission observed, the Annan Commission's mandate, quote, was focused on proposing concrete measures for improving the welfare of all people in Rakhine State. It was not mandated to investigate specific cases of alleged human rights violations, and it did not make any such investigation or finding. Mr. President, Myanmar has told us that its clearance operations were not aimed at destroying the Rohingya, but were actually intended, to quote the agent, quote, to clear an area of insurgents or terrorists by deliberately killing Rohingya children, slaughtered mercilessly by the Tatmadaw in these clearance operations. Many were infants, beaten to death, or torn from their mother's arms and thrown into a river to drown. How many of them were terrorists? By raping and gang raping and savagely mutilating women and girls? Is that indicative of fighting terrorism or of committing genocide against a hated group? by burning to the ground hundreds of villages and thousands of homes with entire families forced to remain inside? Where is the evidence that the Tatmadaws' clearance operations were primarily directed at insurgents or terrorists and not at the Rohingya population? There is very little. We have been told that the trigger for the 2017 clearance operation was an attack by ARSA on 25 August of that year. But contemporaneous reporting from Myanmar shows that the Tatmadaw deployed its notorious light infantry divisions to northern Rakhine State 2 weeks earlier, as of 11 August, as reflected in this article in the Irrawaddy at tab 27, complete with photograph of arriving troops and quotes from senior military officers. The evidence is more consistent with Senior General Min Aung Hlaing's Facebook post that the troops were deployed because it was time to solve the Bengali problem once and for all. Mr. President, we do not contend that there were no insurgents or that Myanmar did not have the right to take military action against them. But we do contend that armed conflict can never be an excuse for genocide. As the UN fact-finding mission observed, regarding the Tatmadaws' conduct of these clearance operations, quote, "There was not the least effort on their part to make any distinction between ARSA fighters and civilians, or to specifically target a military objective, or identify and repel an immediate threat. Everyone was a target, and no one was spared. Mothers, infants, pregnant women, the old and infirmed, all fell victim to this ruthless campaign." Professor Shabas helpfully confirmed that reports of fact-finding missions like this one may contain valuable information. However, he criticized the UN mission's conclusions in its September 2019 report that evidence of Myanmar's genocidal intentions had strengthened over the past year, on the ground that the mission did not mention how or on what basis it reached that conclusion. He must have skipped over all the relevant paragraphs. Paragraph 9, for example, summarizes the evidence the mission considered in reaching its conclusion. It includes, quote, "the government's hostile policies toward the Rohingya, including its continued denial of citizenship and ethnic identity, the living conditions to which it subjects them, its failure to reform laws that subjugate the Rohingya people, the continuation of hate speech directed at the Rohingya, its prior commission of genocide, and its disregard for accountability in relation to the clearance operations of 2016 and 2017. Much of the report consists of extensive details supporting all of these findings. Professor Shabas was also mistaken in asserting that there are no mass graves. To be sure, Myanmar has not made it easy to find them. It has systematically denied independent fact-finders and human rights organizations, as well as journalists, access to areas of Rakhine State where its clearance operations were carried out. Nevertheless, the Associated Press located at least 5 mass graves of Rohingyas. The report is located at tab 28 of your judges' folders. Professor Okowa told you that the requirement of urgency is not met and that provisional measures should be denied because, allegedly, the decision to sue Myanmar was made in March 2019 and the application was not filed until November. She asked, somewhat sarcastically, it appeared, quote, was there something that happened in the interim that gave urgency to the request for provisional measures? The answer is yes. The submission of the UN fact-finding mission's report in September 2019, which concluded that evidence of Myanmar's genocidal intent had strengthened in the past year and that, quote, there is a serious risk that genocidal actions may occur or recur. That prompted the Gambia to proceed as quickly as possible to retain counsel and file the application. I would also refer Professor Okoa to her colleague, Professor Zimmerman, who was listed as counsel to Myanmar in these proceedings. In his commentary on Article 41 of the court statute, he states, quote, under the aspect of urgency, it is not relevant whether the situation complained of had already existed for a considerable time when the request was filed. For what is important is only the imminence of action prejudicial to the rights at stake. Mr. President, we demonstrated on Tuesday that there is an urgent need for provisional measures to prevent irreparable harm to the rights of the Gambia that are at issue in this case, and that the case for provisional measures here is among the most compelling that have ever been presented to the court. Nothing Myanmar said yesterday contradicts this. The fact-finding mission's conclusion that the only reasonable inference to be drawn from Myanmar's pattern of conduct is genocidal intent still stands. Indeed, as we have seen this morning, Myanmar either admits or fails to deny what the extensive evidence we submitted makes perfectly clear. There is an urgent need for provisional measures to prevent irreparable harm to the Gambia's rights as a state party to the Genocide Convention. Mr. President, members of the court, this concludes my presentation. I thank you again for your kind courtesy and patient attention, and I ask that you call my colleague, Professor Darjan, to the podium.